Welcome to presentation 6 on my series on defending Australia. This time we are looking at the threat from China, notably why and how it is a military threat. You simply can't prepare a defence strategy without answering these basic questions. This map is my end conclusion, and I hope you will stay with me as I explain its development and meaning. Before I start, I shall once again declare both a bias and also why this presentation is highly subjective. This will take a little explanation. My interest and academic background is in history. Unlike most, I have some sympathy for the much maligned British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. To me, he is more than the usual presentation of some type of naive fool that was easily duped by Hitler. Instead, I find him a rather tragic figure. He was trying to avoid another war of the great powers, a war of trenches and giant airships. Bluntly, no reasonable statesman wanted to see another great war. Equally, outside of the not well understood Armenian genocide and Stalin's famine, the world was yet to see an industrial state turn all of its powers not only to conquer, but to kill civilians on an incredible scale. Dictators were common in Europe in the 1930s, and there was no reason that Hitler or Stalin would prove any different to Mussolini or Franco. But Chamberlain was incapable of understanding the imperatives of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. They were not authoritarian, but totalitarian. He could not comprehend the difference that drove these monsters to murder on an inhuman scale. In order to understand Xi and the CCP, you have to go no further than Europe in the 1930s. Mussolini's conquest of Ethiopia, Hitler's attack on Poland, Stalin's attack on Finland, and more recently Galtieri's attempt to seize the Falklands make little or no sense. While there are similarities between these attacks, there are also significant differences that is beyond the scope of this presentation. Rather, I am attempting to discuss the imperatives that drove these military adventures and why it is that they make China a risk for Australia. Why and how? The questions that any defence strategy must ask. Their answers are the reality that Chamberlain was incapable of understanding, but trying to apply these questions to China also makes this presentation quite subjective. My bias is quite simple. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is probably the most murderous regime in history. A minimum of 15 million Chinese were murdered or starved to death for its ideology. Some historians actually put this number as high as 70 million. Any regime that can do this to its own people does not think like the rest of the world. Note also there are substantial factors that I am leaving out of this presentation or not discussing in depth. They include strategic cultures and the growing use of technology against its own people, as well as those overseas. I am also largely going to leave South Korea out of this discussion because it is somewhat unique due to the threat from the north. So having said that, let me begin. The first section of this presentation asks the question why. In order to do so, I shall define the basic reasons for why China is a military threat to Australia as pull, push, break and exploitation factors. Please note I've kept on cutting this presentation back just to reduce its length until it is now purely an overview. You could argue that in the original presentation you couldn't see the forest for the trees, but now I worry that you can't see the trees for the forest. Still, my hope is that it will start a vibrant discussion in the comments and hopefully elsewhere, as has happened before. Let's start with the pull factors, which are fairly easy to define, but are quite difficult to assess. The primary pull factors are alliances and defence agreements, or, if you like, being pulled into war not by your own actions. An example is Australia's wars of choice in the Middle East that resulted from our relationship with the United States. In the countries of our region, the pull factors largely means dragging America into a conflict. Ignoring Taiwan, America has bilateral defensive pacts of varying degrees with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, which is the weakest, and of course Australia. Note that there are no formal alliances between any of the Asian nations, and any agreements are quite limited in scope. There are no pull factors for China except North Korea. Of the 4 American allies, the only regional pull factors are Japan and Australia's, although Japan's is limited and results from the use of American air bases in Taiwan's defence. Australia's pull factors are peculiar, as a relationship with America has evolved to cover almost all of Southeast Asia. This is why the pull factors we should be concerned about are America's, because we'll be dragged along. The issue for Australia is understanding the risk of these American alliances with our Asian neighbours. I'll go into this a bit later when discussing the break and exploitation factors. Taking America's pull factors out of the equation means that these are the only pull factors for all the countries in Southeast Asia. It is, however, vitally important to understand the push factors. The first thing you have to remember, which is so blindingly obvious that I'm surprised at how often it is ignored, is that China is a totalitarian state. It simply does not view the world in terms of international relations, trade, or even other state sovereignty the same way as do Western countries. The only thing that matters is the survival of the party. Historically, as shown time after time throughout history, the greatest threat to any totalitarian regime is its own people. Its greatest fear is domestic unrest that can threaten the regime. The need for domestic stability to prevent unrest creates the push factors that makes all totalitarian states dangerous to other countries in their region. The traditional and easiest way to protect the regime is to define itself as the good guys, but in order to do so, you need to define who is evil. History is replete with examples of totalitarian states identifying the enemy within, that is, internal enemies of the people, and also the enemy without, that is, the external enemies of the people. Massive amounts of propaganda are put out by the regime to convince their population that these enemies are a threat that only the regime can protect them from. In China, the internal enemies are pretty obvious. It includes the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Falun Gong, and other organised religions, as well as democracy champions, especially those from Tiananmen Square and Hong Kong. In total, depending on the source, anywhere from 5 to 10% of China's population belongs to ethnic and/or religious groups that are routinely targeted by state media and even security agencies as enemies of the people. The enemy without for China also seems fairly obvious. America is the great enemy. It is defined as posing an existential threat to the safety, prosperity, and sovereignty of all Chinese. Equally, other regional countries who stand up to China are described in propaganda as nothing more than Americans' puppets. The irony of Chinese wealth being built upon its economic ties with the West, especially America, is lost on the regime. Taiwan is interesting. It is both an internal enemy and also, as an American puppet, an external enemy. However, militarily, for over 50 years being one of China's external enemies didn't matter. Then Deng released the economic chains. He created an economic system based on crony capitalism. Taxes from the country's poorest, combined with unbelievable working conditions, created enormous wealth for the new industrialists and their party patrons. Within 30 years, China went from having no billionaires to well over 1,000. Meanwhile, workers in the new high-tech industries tried to live a life around the new 996 culture, which means working 12 hours a day from 9 till 9, 6 days a week. There are only a few options that the party can use to justify this massive transfer of wealth that resulted from crony capitalism. The powerless are told to conform, work hard, pay their taxes, and watch as their military grows big enough to defeat the enemy. Once achieved, peace and prosperity will supposedly follow. Therefore, bluntly, the driving force behind China's strategic policy is a domestic public opinion that the regime itself tries to shape for its own benefit. At first glance, it may not seem really that different to Western democracies, but that's a superficial comparison. The CCP does not worry about elections, but it does worry about regime change, even if it is just within CCP factions. Regime change will see party leaders at all levels lose their influence and wealth. They are often imprisoned or even killed. This is why avoiding domestic upheaval is a major driver of China's strategic policy. It's also always important to remember that war as a domestic propaganda strategy has been central to maintaining the CCP. The Korean War caused immense economic hardship and loss of life, but it also solidified support for Mao's regime. It turned America, who 5 years earlier was China's greatest ally during the horrific Japanese invasion, into its greatest enemy. Note also that the Korean War was limited in scope and did not pose a military threat to the regime. In comparison, the CCP would have seen the mistakes of autocratic regimes that led to their downfall. In the Falklands War in the early 80s, Galtieri went from becoming a new leader of a shaky junta facing civil unrest to becoming a national hero following the successful invasion of the Falklands. However, he could not control escalation, and Thatcher's response was to take the islands back. For Galtieri, his career ended with jail, and he took the rest of the junta with him. It is an important lesson the CCP understands. However, simply launching a war without some type of propaganda groundwork is counterproductive. China's invasion of Vietnam was purely for geopolitical reasons. Domestically, China was seen as attacking a nation who, just a few years earlier, was presented as not only fighting the great enemy, America, but also defeating them. Then, barely 4 years later, the PLA not only invaded Vietnam, but were soundly defeated. The kindest assessment of the domestic attitude to the war was one of total apathy. That war is now barely mentioned in China. The Chinese assessment of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan would have noted that it was also for geopolitical reasons, that it became open-ended and also deeply unpopular. Eventually, it played a significant role in the fall of the Soviet Union. The lesson for the CCP, and this is important, is that any military action must be preceded by a prolonged and aggressive propaganda campaign to gain support, followed by a limited, controlled and victorious campaign that can then provide a propaganda boost to the regime. The Soviet Union also provided the example that there is a time limit on the benefits of a propaganda promising victory against the great enemy. By 1989, Russians were well aware that, after 40 years of promises and propaganda, not only was the West not defeated, but Russians were increasingly aware it was wealthier and that the living conditions in the West were much better than theirs. These factors all played a major role in the fall of the Soviet Union. That is a fate China wishes to avoid. Time and economic downturn are one of the two greatest causes of public discontent that can be offset by military success. A final factor that cannot be ignored is ideology and personality. Xi is, bluntly, a political thug masquerading as an intellectual. He is in his early 70s, probably looking for a legacy, as well as being scared of what will happen to him if he stands down. In terms of push factors, like all totalitarian leaders, he is the wild card. If you accept these assessments, then China's foreign policy has 4 drivers that create the factors that make it a military threat. They are: if it does not take some form of action against Taiwan initially, and subsequently against America's proxies, then it will eventually face domestic unrest that threatens the regime. Therefore, it must seek short and victorious military conflicts that are acceptable to domestic opinion. However, failing to defeat America during a major Pacific War would lead to significant domestic unrest and the probability of regime change, which means that limited wars that can avoid escalation with America, regardless of the human or financial cost, are not only desirable, but also needed to achieve the required domestic propaganda benefits. China's centrally planned economy has slowed remarkably since its COVID lockdowns. There is growing unemployment, and those who work are also experiencing cuts to existing salaries and benefits. If the economic situation in a totalitarian country worsens and is prolonged, there is a serious risk of public discontent that may threaten the regime. It's already happened in China during the student demonstrations against the government during COVID. The need for distractions makes this a significant push factor. Another push factor is that the relentless need for an external enemy will not stop even with the fall of Taiwan. Obviously, the primary enemy will remain the United States, plus its regional puppets. The above chart tells only part of the story of this military expansion. Not only is the Navy expanding, it is also replacing older ships with more modern ships. As an example, although there was no increase in the number of diesel submarines, around 30 older boats have already been replaced or will be replaced by 2025. The profits from this shipbuilding means enormous wealth and bribes for China's elites. The very nature of crony capitalism means it is almost impossible to change direction, and that's especially true in a totalitarian state. Following the end of the Cold War, the West achieved a significant decrease in defence spending, especially in Europe. The history of post-Second World War dictatorships, such as the Soviet Union, North Korea, Iraq and Iran, shows that they will never have a peace dividend. Even in post-communist Russia, once it transitioned from a qualified democracy to Putin's dictatorship, the decline in defence spending was quickly reversed. Instead, especially in totalitarian states, there will only ever be the need for greater sacrifice. China is no different. There will be no peace dividend after the fall of Taiwan. Combined with the fact that China is entering a period of economic decline, whose impact is completely unclear. The only guarantee is that any economic downturn can never be the regime's fault. China's shipbuilding program is also not just for warships. One of the less known aspects of China's maritime building program is its fishing industry. It took off during Deng's reforms and has continued to grow quite remarkably. In 2022, China's wild catch of seafood was over 13 million tonnes. In comparison, the Bureau of Statistics gave total Australian production as under 200,000 tonnes, which is about the amount required to achieve a sustainable fishing industry in all of Australia's waters. When we look at the resources of the South China Sea, we tend to think of oil, etc. For the average Chinese, it is fish. This has also created another surprising push factor. I'm going to go on about this a little, as it is a very important push and exploitation factor. The question being, can Australia respond to aggression based on this push factor? As local stocks are overfished or exhausted, China's deep water fishing fleet becomes significantly more important. Theoretical limits set by the regime simply reflect the size of the deep water fishing fleet in 2023. This growth in China's deep sea fishing fleet has provided a tremendous positive for the regime. It created a massive consumer demand that was met and for which it has taken the credit. It also resulted in an equally massive growth in employment and wealth. Failure to maintain that flow again creates a serious risk of domestic unrest. It is simply really quite important to understand the size of the internal market for seafood products that the regime must satisfy, and the size of the industry needed to satisfy that demand. An interesting example of the size of China's deep water fishing fleet is a major environmental dispute in Australia that started in 2012. Only one super trawler was considered too dangerous for use in Tasmanian fisheries. The Chinese have around 2,500 of these ships, often significantly larger, plus another 15,000 smaller vessels. The global scale of China's fishing is both difficult to understand and rarely discussed, let alone its environmental impact. Its fleets have a global reach and literally strip mine entire maritime ecosystems. As a result, its heavily subsidized fleets are forced to adventure further and further afield. Its ships have had to travel beyond the Pacific Ocean through the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, sometimes under foreign flags. In 2020, one of its fleets reached the Galapagos Island Marine Sanctuary. With over 200 deep-water fishing ships, that single fleet was larger than the combined navies of all the South American nations with Pacific coastlines. Australia has several fisheries vulnerable to such an incursion. Relatively untouched fisheries creates a push factor for the Chinese. It also creates a policy nightmare for countries from the Pacific to the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, especially if the waters in their exclusive economic zone are disputed, as are our claims off Antarctica. It is inevitable that Chinese deep-water fishing fleets will expand their area of operations, including areas that are Australian responsibilities. Domestic propaganda is probably the strongest push factor. China's propaganda targets are, of course, America, but also Japan, India, and the Philippines. Given our size and relative importance, one of the more interesting targets of Chinese propaganda is Australia. At times, we have been the subject of Chinese state media more than any other nation except America. Some of it is really quite childish, such as this proof of Australian spying that made it into their newspapers. Others are a bit more sophisticated, such as more recent allegations of Australian military spying on China's navy and the need for the military to stand up to Australian provocation. The first played on fears of the enemy within, while the later portrayed Australia as a military threat because of its relationship with America. Two push factors stem from the Chinese diaspora. Firstly, it represents the external version of the enemy within. On one level, any dissidents given overseas sanctuary are ruthlessly pursued by state security, hence China's absurd security laws impacting any ethnic Chinese around the world, regardless of their nationality. There are repeated reports of forced removals, either by coercion or brute force, in Western countries. This aggressive behaviour obviously creates diplomatic conflict. Secondly, countries giving support to dissidents are routinely targeted in Chinese state media. Equally, allegations of oppression by foreign governments against ethnic Chinese also feed into domestic propaganda, in which the regime is portrayed as a champion for all Chinese around the world. In this, it is not unlike America, which often uses the same justification. However, the main difference is that the primary target of China's domestic propaganda are the US, Canada, and Australia. Please note that I am not in any way suggesting action against Australians of Chinese descent or on a visa from China. They play no role in Chinese domestic propaganda and should not be blamed or targeted for what the CCP does. The final push factor is that relentless propaganda that defines other nations as inherently evil. As usual in totalitarian regimes, race plays a major part. Japan is the prime example for Chinese propaganda. The Chinese regime continues to use the atrocities committed by Japan, starting with its invasion of China in 1930, as a propaganda tool. This propaganda actually accelerated dramatically under Xi, with around 2,000 propaganda movies on Japan's invasion being produced by the state media in the 10 years after Xi took power. And in addition, there was well over 100 long-running TV dramas. Disputes with other countries that are reported in the state media, such as America, Australia, India, and Canada, often reverse the narrative, portraying them as deeply racist countries in comparison to a morally superior China. The irony of Chinese treatments of its ethnic minorities, including Africans, is probably lost on the regime and its champions. Nevertheless, such propaganda undoubtedly benefits the regime. However, it again creates a problem of an expectation of military action in response to that propaganda. Let's go back to the map and list the countries, excluding Taiwan, that are most subject to the push factors that I have discussed. Those push factors are propaganda targets, those who can be blamed for economic downturns, the avoidance of food shortages, the diaspora as victims who need protection, and the countries who provide a safe haven for dissidents, and of course racism. Most of us know that term as better as a concept of the superior race, a concept that has bedeviled human history. Now I'll look at the brake factors. Brake factors are the elements that act against military aggression. They are quite diverse, but for this presentation, I've tried to keep their number relatively small. They are in order: a lack of or working against any domestic propaganda, the risk of escalation with America, and counterintuitively, for a maritime region, a large army. Oddly enough, the first brake factor stems from China's push factors. Any military aggression that does not comply with China's domestic propaganda creates the risk of civil unrest, especially if it is unsuccessful. Escalating a border dispute with Russia makes no sense given their de facto alliance against America, nor does any significant action against Myanmar when China supports that unfortunate country's brutal dictatorship in its never-ending civil war. These are the countries in Southeast Asia with which China has some type of accord. Equally, excluding India, China has made accords with all the countries with which it has land borders in return for their acquiescence. It rarely launches internal propaganda campaigns against them. Therefore, this brake factor applies to all its land borders, but for reducing congestion, I will leave most of the land partners off the map. The second brake factor is some type of defensive pact with America. That's pretty obvious. The final brake factor is a strong army. Obviously, Japan has a powerful military, and that includes all its air, land and sea forces. That acts as a brake. But we tend to think of countries like the Philippines and Indonesia to be militarily weak. This is certainly true of their navies and air force, but let's look at some interesting numbers. Equally, their ground forces are fairly aggressive and not overly concerned about civilian casualties. A military adventure against any of these nations, even a limited raid involving troops on the ground, would involve immediate and bloody fighting. The regime would risk losing control of the adventure. Equally, the bloodier and more prolonged the combat, it actually creates the real possibility of escalation involving America, even if it's simply because of their commitment to maintaining the first and second island chains. Army size, combined with a fairly aggressive military philosophy and an expectation of local commanders acting on their own initiative, is a significant brake on China's ability to limit the conflict. Finally, I'm going to look at exploitation factors. My definition of an exploitation factor is one that creates an event that can dramatically change the strategic situation. This definition is a little bit more nuanced than I've put in this overview, but before I discuss it, I need to make 2 points. Firstly, this next section stems from the chapters of my book that discusses strategic cultures and their implications across the region, not just for China. I simply didn't cover it in this presentation, not because I want you to buy my book, but because this is the wrong format and this presentation is already becoming far too long. The second point I wish to make is actually about a significant weakness in this presentation. It is weighting. Not all factors are equal. Some have greater weight than others. As an example, the weight we should give to fishing as a push factor is currently quite higher than that for other resources. The reason is that the economic benefit of globalization allows China to gain access to resources such as coal and iron ore from around the world to offset disputes it is having with any country in this region. However, globalization is itself reliant upon what is called a unipolar global system based on American dominance. A multipolar system significantly reduces the economic flexibility for good or ill of globalization. Under different circumstances, the relative weightings for these push factors may well change, and in response, we would need to have a far more flexible defense strategy than we do now. The discussion on weighting brings us back to the risk associated with the main exploitation factor. In my assessment, its weighting is very high because it complements several of the push factors and China's strategic culture. The exploitation factor is obviously caused by having an alliance with America. Let's go back a step. There is no NATO that provides a unified military response to any act of aggression against one of its members. Instead, America has a series of bilateral agreements in the region. In terms of combined military strength, at the top is Japan, at the bottom is the Philippines. The Philippines have actually vacillated between America and China over the last few years, only returning to America because China considered access to fisheries far more important than friendly relations with the Philippines. The ability of each country in this group to stand up to China is obviously tied to the level of belief they have in America coming to their aid. There is a complicating factor to this belief. Obviously, Japan and South Korea look to America's military power in the event of any conventional war, but America's policy of extended nuclear deterrence, E&D, is actually far more important. It prevents nuclear blackmail by China, or hopefully the actual use of China of nuclear weapons. It means America will risk sacrificing its West Coast cities at the very least by retaliating to any nuclear attack on its partners. The debate in South Korea, with its own large nuclear industry, and about developing nuclear weapons shows that they are increasingly concerned about American commitment to E&D. Equally, should South Korea go nuclear, it would be seen as a breach of trust by America, and the repercussions for the alliance could be severe. This last example shows how trust is a far more basic aspect to these relations than any geopolitics. The level of trust countries in this region have with America determines their willingness to resist China's aggression. The level of trust is determined by America's reaction to events impacting other American partners in the Western Pacific, even if America's other allies themselves will not get involved. America's most important partners are the liberal democracies of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Australia. If America fails to act for one, then the level of trust in America by its other partners declines, perhaps creating an entirely new strategic reality. Equally, uncertainty of how America will react is a challenge for China. Finding out the limits of military action available before America reacts is achieved by microaggressions, which is better known as grey zone warfare. These microaggressions target America's allies, not America direct, simply because America is unlikely to aggressively respond to an indirect act. Therefore, an exploitive factor means some type of military action against one of these four that results in such a weak American response that the others lose some or significant trust in their own alliance. Equally, lacking any form of discussion or preparation in Australia, an act of aggression would prove a political tsunami that could actually end in China's favour. The problem for China is that it has, realistically, reached the full extent of its microaggressions against Taiwan, Japan, and the Philippines. The problem for Australia is that it leaves us. An assessment of all these risk factors creates a map that I displayed at the very beginning of the presentation. First are the pull factors. Now I'll list the far more numerous push factors. Then, after the push factors, comes the brake factors. And finally, the exploitation factor. At the very beginning, I referred to Chamberlain and my belief that he was a rather tragic figure. He did so because he failed to assess the internal imperatives in Germany, created by the mix of ideology and regime survival that made successful military adventures not only desirable, but necessary. If you are willing to accept this premise, then the result of assessing China's imperatives that would lead to conflict is not a good look for Australia. Perhaps the most controversial aspect is the missing brake factor for Australia, that of the Army. My position is that the structure of the ADF does not deter the most likely form of Chinese aggression. Therefore, just as important as the question why, we now have to look at how. And that's the second part, or part two, of this series on why China is a threat to Australia.